is Kate Collins. I'm the Director of Strategy at Calgary Economic Development, and in the portfolio of strategy is our city's economic strategy, Calgary in the New Economy, which has one of the 5 interconnected drivers of our city's economy being talent. And so talent, from a Calgary Economic Development perspective, where our organization's mandate is to expand, retain, and attract companies, people, and investment to Calgary for long-term economic prosperity. Talent is so central to everything that we do at Calgary Economic Development, because talent is what brings companies to Calgary, and having the right people in our city with the right skill sets and the right competencies for the future is critically important for where we want to be as a city. As we work to diversify our economy, we're always, of course, looking for that talent that is helping us diversify our economy. We can't diversify our economy if we don't have the companies here in Calgary to do that, but they need the talent and the workforce to really support that capacity building and diversification. So that's kind of one piece. And then when I think about open learning and the opportunity that we have here with this open learning lab, it's something that's not being done, David will say, really anywhere that we've looked. And so for an organization that, like CED, that is out there promoting Calgary and like why you would come to Calgary, it's an incredible thing to be able to say our city is innovating in ways that have not been done before, and like, here's proof. We are creating this, we are thinking differently about how people in our city learn, how they can access different learning opportunities, and how our companies that are here are really assessing and like using competencies in a different way from just the standard, credential university degrees, like for hiring and things like that. So I think that's, for me, where this is really exciting, is it positions Calgary as a place that is innovative and is willing to try new things and take risks that haven't been taken before. So maybe I'll leave it there and I'll pass it to Heather then.
Great. So I'm Heather Robertson. I'm Director of Service Design and Innovation at the Calgary Public Library. I've worked in academic and public libraries for about 25 years now, been at Calgary Public for just over 20. And I'm excited to be here because a lot of my career has been focused on looking at open learning environments and systems, and particularly looking at the way in which libraries can transform our service models to support growth in our communities. And when I think about open learning and the concept of open learning and the concept of the open learning lab, 3 things stick out for me and that align really much with the work that I do in public libraries and the role that they play. And one of them is empowering lifelong learning. That people, certainly in my industry, we're supporting people learning from the, baby to senior, and understanding that throughout a life of learning, that journey looks different at many different points. And so we have to be able to adapt and adjust our learning systems and our learning environments and create navigation pathways to help people connect with the things that they need at the time that they need it. And foster that mindset of curiosity and look beyond just our traditional sense of what a learning environment looks like. It's not just a program in a classroom, but it's a space as well. How do we create spaces where people can collide and new ideas can be sparked and we can open new doors? So that's one thing that sticks out for me. The other is around reducing barriers and increasing access. And the skills development framework talks a lot about the number of different learning opportunities in our city and how that can be so overwhelming, but it also is so fantastic. And how do we create a continuum around that to reduce barriers, make sure that people can access what they need and connect in with what they are looking for in the way that they're looking for it. So everybody learns differently, and there's lots of different models that we can use. The other thing I would say too is really about designing that continuum and thinking about partnerships. There's so much opportunity to collaborate in our city and collaborate in different ways. I truly believe that if we leverage the knowledge and the experience and the resources that we have in our communities, we can make better decisions and we can have a greater impact. And that's only going to benefit the learners, the employers, and the learning organizations. It's really a full circle impact model. So I think it's an exciting opportunity, and looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Heather. So just to back up, I'm just going to provide context to everyone. So as many of you know, the LearningCITY Collective, we've been doing research starting in about 2019 around different aspects of the learning system. And if anyone wanted to go to learningcity.ca, all the research is there under our resource center. But one of the studies we did in collaboration with Calgary Economic Development was this Learning City audit that we talk about, and how large is the learning system. And we took a very different approach to this, because based on a whole lot of research we've done over the years, and I always say it's funny when you ask somebody, kind of what's that transformative moment in their life when they changed, they learned something. And you know, if you reflect on that as individuals, it rarely happens in a place with a blackboard. It was probably traveling somewhere. It was on the top of a mountain. It was on a field. It was in an art class. Some moment in your life when all of a sudden, you know, you learned something new and it gave you a new inflection point and transformed you. So when we did the audit, we said, well, let's find those moments. And that's exactly when we audited. And what we found was identified 3,000 learning organizations in the city, delivering about 31,000 programs and about 3.5 million learning experiences across the city each year. But as Heather noted, it's not a system. It's a random group of incredibly passionate individuals, whether they be in the active economy, the creative economy, whether they be part of religious organizations. So the opportunity with open learning, and to Heather's point around the ability to open up the labor market, is to start to acknowledge that learning happens at so many different places that the capacity is about collaboration, harmonization, and then using that to innovate. And so, you know, we've dropped the term the Open Learning Lab a few times here. So the Open Learning Lab, just for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's a Learning City Collective collaboration with Mount Royal University that is opening later in June. And what we've been doing on the institutional side through a program called Accelerate U, we're going to be having up to 1,000 students located on Bow Valley Square with about 15,000 square feet donated by Oxford Properties and supported by the City of Calgary and the Calgary Downtown Association. But it's not just going to be a classroom. It's not just going to be a place for students. We're in fact going to be co-locating up to 40 community partners, large organizations to startups to nonprofit organizations that will also be working out of there. And this is the idea of curating a collision. What if we actually put students and collaborative working directly with partners in the community? Will that create the magic? And how can we curate those opportunities and facilitate those opportunities? As Kate noted, to our knowledge, there is no experience of this because it's truly an open environment. It's open to all post-secondary institutions. It's open to all parts of the learning system, and it's open to employers. And trying to be able to create a home at an incremental baby step to see how that magic can work together in a collaborative environment. So maybe just pose that into a question then. So given, you know, Jeff, we've got 3,000 organizations, this on the educator side. Open learning recognizes all of a sudden, as you noted, 57,000 employers are not just consumers of talent, they're actually in this model co-creator of talent. And so there's now a whole different role for employers. Can you think about that context in your experience of where you've actually seen open learning make a difference in accelerating, you know, workforce and labor force development? Jeff, that's you.
My turn to not unmute. There you go. So I mean, my experience is military. My background, I came out of the Canadian Air Force. Some of the history of rapid learning and the collisions that happened, if you go back into back to the, you know, the Second World War, slightly, I mean, it's a different environment, but where, you know, we as a country had to rapidly develop a workforce from nothing. And that only occurred because we had people who were ready, willing, and able to fill a lot of those roles. And I'm speaking like the whole Rosie the Riveter thing, right? But that worked because of the direct involvement of the industries to teach the necessary skills to grow the people in ways that for the time was unheard of. We know that when you combine good learning experiences with proper training for the instructors and motivated individuals, amazing things will happen. I mean, we saw it, we've seen it over and over again. You see it in remote communities where people have been given the opportunity to learn things in a non-traditional way, and they flourish. And I think creating the lab and the kind of the opportunity for what we'll call programmed accidents to happen, where we kind of curate those interactions between companies and not always the same company, because again there'll be multiple companies. So the interactions between the companies and the students, between the students and the profs, between the profs and the companies, I think it creates a really rich ecosystem for learning. And I'm really excited to see what's going to happen coming out of it, because I think for sure the students are going to benefit from it. But I think overall, our experience in terms of opening up the pathways is that the companies will experience a ton of growth as a result of it as well, which is only good for it's good for Calgary, it's good for the economy, and it'll be great for downtown.
One of the comments there, Jeff, any educator will tell you, we learn as much from our students as our students learn from us. And so that idea of this Venn diagram in which we're now putting employers as part of that relationship, it's got to be a three-way win for this to really scale. Okay.
Yeah, maybe from a real world example perspective, when I was prepping for the panel, I was kind of taken back to something that a friend of mine and I when we were in university at the University of Waterloo, and they have a great co-op program, and a friend of mine was in their program called Knowledge Integration, and it was basically this program where you could take and courses from really any faculty and department at the university, mangle it into a bachelor degree of knowledge integration. But at the foundation, there were these courses around user design. And where I'm going with this is a friend of mine and I thought about this concept of taking courses from different universities across Canada, like expanding this knowledge integration kind of program model to like all universities in Canada, to say, could you build your own degree and have courses from universities across Canada that could become this Bachelor of X arts, for example. But you could really get experience, whether that's experiential learning in different cities across Canada. And we did find that in Europe, they have an Erasmus Mundus master's program that does just that. And so I always just think about how like it's been done before. Like we have had post-secondaries elsewhere collaborate on like putting really like the learner at the center and allowing the learner to have a choose your own adventure like at a post-secondary level. So I feel like from a real world example, that kind of innovative thinking gets me super excited. And I think that in Calgary, honestly, we have kind of the basis for PSI collaboration, and I'm just thinking about it from a post-secondary perspective, but from a PSI collaboration perspective, now that we've figured out work integrated learning across all 7 post-secondaries, like what else could we collaborate on, right? And so I feel like there's that nugget of possibility.
Awesome. Heather.
Yeah, so I think probably the example that I would think about is going back to access, building a little bit on what you were talking about, Kate. So if we think about, we have those formal education programs, and then we have places like public libraries and community organizations that offer that non-credentialed informal learning. And it's really about how do we open the doors and create access points for people to learn in different ways. And I love your phrase of create your own adventure, because I think that speaks to when I think about, as an example, if you have a library card, you can access over 75 e-resources that don't just offer access to ebooks and like films and movies. That's great. It's all fun. But it also offers free access to things like LinkedIn Learning, Gale courses, Learning Express, resources that offer certification or certificate completion courses that people can choose and take and create their own package of skill development resources. So it's something where, we had to think about how do you build a navigation pathway in there, because when you think about the number of courses in there, and how do you pick the right ones, right? Having a facilitator to help people connect in and understand what's available, understand what's, the array of information that they can access, and then how to fit or connect with the things that make the most sense to them in that moment. And then thinking beyond that is like, it's great, it's access to courses, but then it's the wraparound as well. So it's the environment. So when you think about the Open Learning Lab, when you think about something like a digital library, it's not just about providing access to the material, but it's the supports to enable people to engage with that material. So at the library, we have technology resources. You have free Wi-Fi, free printing. You can borrow a computer to take home. You can take a digital literacy class, because we recognize that the resources that are available are excellent and they're accessible. But if you don't have the skills and tools in which to use them, then you wouldn't be able to have that open door in the same way as others. So it's interesting to think about something like the Open Learning Lab model, and ways, because it's not just about providing access to content, but it's about providing access to the support resources and the collaborations, the collisions. I love how we're using that term, that encourage and empower learners to participate.
So this idea of the open learning, it's a double-edged sword, Heather. And of course, the library and all libraries are truly the OG, as my hip kids would say, when it comes to open learning, because that's what you do, right? But you know what? I'm just going to kind of slide in this idea of empowerment, where it's a double-edged sword, is there's a reason why restaurants have menus, because if everyone was choose your own adventure, people get paralyzed by choice. As a marketer, that's the reality. And so we've got that fine line, because when I drop those numbers of 3,000, learning organizations, 30,000 programs, 3.5 million opportunities, people don't go, wow, that's awesome. They go, oh my God, where do I start? So let me ask you that question around your experience at the library, because you have truly thousands of resources and your client base is as broad as our city and as diverse as our city. How do you manage that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And really it comes back to, what I was mentioning earlier about that facilitator, that navigating piece. I mean, certainly librarians have been doing this for centuries in terms of creating pathways to different resources that will address someone's question or their learning need. And also beyond sort of curating information and, let's find your next great read. It's not just about what's in the facility, but understanding what's around the community. So a lot of what we have to do is understand who are the community partners in this field, what services can we refer people out to, but also recognizing where limitations can come in, because librarians are not specialists. We are not financial literacy experts. We're not health experts. And lots of the questions that can come up may need a more customized or personalized approach. And so building in through collaborative models, those opportunities to customize navigation pathways is really powerful for learners. It puts them more in the driver's seat. And I'll give you a concrete example. We have a partnership with Bow Valley College where they bring over career counselors to offer what's called Job Desk. It's a service that's a drop-in, pops up pretty much 7 or 8 hours a day at the Central Library. And it is a place where our career counselors are available. And if you pop into the library and you come across it, they're there. They can help you in a more personalized, customized way navigate your questions in that particular subject area. The beauty of that is not only do we get an opportunity to extend experts into community more because the library has extensive reach throughout the city, but we also have the opportunity to create those collisions because, again, some people don't know about what's available. And by coming into a library, they could have come in for a variety of different reasons. They've come across a service and been able to get in touch with something that can provide them that more customized support and help them get started for the next pathway through.
Awesome. So I'm just going to pivot a little. I see some questions around credentials versus competencies in the chat. I'm just going to kind of raise that. The whole, certainly studying this for years, and you look at, I always call it hiring employment is fundamentally a risk management exercise. I need to hire somebody. How can I do it in a manner in which I have the greatest opportunity to hire the right person, the greatest chance of success, and mitigate my risk as an employer? And historically, we sit there and go, well, that's called a credential of some type, often provided by a post-secondary institution that then says you can do what you say you can do, theoretically. Open learning somewhat flips it because we moved from an institutionally centric model to an individually and empowered model where the individual can choose their own adventure, climb their climbing wall, but it doesn't necessarily lead to historical definitions of what we call a credential. And therefore, one of the things I certainly believe in the research we've done, it says employers are such a critical part of this ecosystem, because if they keep asking for a university degree, parents will continue to send kids to four-year degrees because they think it's the holy grail, the golden ticket, the lottery, right? And many of us, as we know, it isn't. So let me pose this question around, can we in fact open the system up as educators, or are we highly dependent on employers concurrently moving from a credential-centric model to a competency-centric model? And Jeff, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the answer is a definitive yes. The competencies are defined by outcomes in the economy, and the only people who know what they are really are the employers. It's they represent the economy. They pay for skill. They pay for outputs. The notion of having employers change their proxies for skill to something that is not, a piece of paper that hangs on a wall, or even an industry credential, professional credential, or experience, which is another one that doesn't actually mean very much in the real world. They use the proxies that they have, right? I think this is a good first step for two reasons. It helps employers, and employers frankly suck at this, right? Really understanding what the degree or the certificate or whatever from the post-secondary institution even means. And so creating those collisions that allow them to better understand what they know, not only, but more importantly, what don't they know? What's the finishing process? What's in the box when it shows up at my door? And what do I have to do with it now? And part of that is understanding the difference between, what you learn in school and what you're going to have to be able to do and apply that in the real world. Part of that is recognizing, again, because I think employers used to recognize this, that what comes out of school isn't finished, right? It's raw material. You got to do something with it. And through the environment and the working environment and the mentoring and the onboarding and everything that you do to create the competencies that you actually need to be successful within your business. And I think over the last, 40 or 50 years, employers have in large part abandoned that responsibility. And I think creating this kind of an environment where employers are brought back in helps to break down those barriers and will help to switch and flip that that notion of from paper-based credentials to competency-based credentials. And the other thing that I think is going on, and this is in parallel, is, and I don't want to take up too much time, but there's technologies being developed right now through, like I mentioned in one of our other meetings, the 1484.20.2 IEEE standard for portable competency statements. They're out there in the field now, and that has the potential to tie competencies as defined by employers to learning as defined by educators, to professional credentials as defined by regulatory bodies, to individual portfolios of skills as defined by the learner, and take all the friction out of the system that we have now. I mean, we use, as employers, we use proxies because it's the best we've got, right? Short of taking somebody out for a one-year test drive, which we did with one of Dave's students, actually, and hired them in January. But it was a low-risk hire because we had basically tested them on all the things we needed them to do over a year. And we knew exactly what we were getting when we hired them. And so that's for an employer, that's the advantage. And once that happens, once employers start embracing that notion, I think the move away from the current proxies to a competency-based proxy is inevitable.
Cool. Hey.
Yeah, I took a little bit of a different perspective on this question, and I actually wonder if the open learning, like I often look at learning as, this is probably for those who are very deep in the learning systems, not the right way to look at it, but I look at learning as kind of like a value chain with like upstream and downstream opportunities. I swear I didn't come from oil and gas, but for me, when I think about the employer, they're kind of the downstream demand of talent. And then what happens upstream, right? When we have open learning, I think the success of open learning is also dependent on the system's ability to make it easy for those downstream to understand what's been created in the open learning system. And I think and maybe a better term for this is what we talk a lot about is harmonizing, right? Harmonizing taxonomy and terminology in our system, harmonizing different micro credentials to mean certain things, and then educating employers. But I think it's incumbent upon the system, if we are going to create this radical shift of open learning and hyper collaboration, it's incumbent upon the system to say, this is what we're moving towards, and actually create that, that harmonizing and navigation that Heather was talking about. So I feel like that's also a key part of success of the learning of open learning is like the system, working better together. And then of course, like supporting the employers to understand what that means for them.
So Heather, I'm going to slightly modify your question just before I tweak you there. One of the things, and you actually, the library was part of this, if you recall a couple of years ago, the question of vocabulary, when you talk about issues of harmonization. And I always say, our labor market is like Europe for the euro, where I'm trying to figure out how to convert a Polish zloty to a French franc, and no one has a clue of the value of it because they are truly different monetary mechanisms. And when I say I'm an excellent communicator, I may have a totally different perspective of what that is relative to an employer or an educator. When it comes to harmonization, I'm going to just, again, lean back into the library because of the very nature of your diverse partners in the community, but also your diverse clients. And this issue of actually trying to harmonize vocabulary, can we open this up unless we start with some of the core fundamental definitions and terminology?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that was exactly where my head went to when I was thinking about this question prior to the panel, because I agree. Like, I think Jeff and Kate, you make really good points. And for me, it is how, and certainly where my brain goes is how can we make it easier to validate and advocate and articulate some of what's happening in institutions like public libraries or other community organizations around that more informal learning process, because we know the value of the skill sets that are happening in those programs. The pilot that David was speaking to, we participated in. It was our English conversation group that we looked at, and we know we had hundreds of newcomers coming through and using that as a path, a step in their journey to practice their English language skills. And we know that it's an extension of the more formal LINK programs, and that it has been beneficial. We've heard that from the feedback in terms of helping newcomers learn the language, feel comfortable in it, and also build these social connections. And how do we articulate that in a way that both the learner can use to advocate for themselves when they're going to employers, but also that we as an organization offering that program can offer out? And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but I do think that that's something that has to be considered, is creating that shared vocabulary or shared understanding. And I think it is coming from more collaboration and working more together with our partners and employers to better understand what the needs are of each particular group, and then how we can quote unquote speak to each other in a way that will make sense and resonate with multiple audiences.
So let me just, one element I want to talk about is this idea of, I've challenged us as a city. We say we have a skills gap problem, and my argument is, are we sure we have a skills problem, or do we have a hiring problem? Because there's above the waterline and below the waterline, and too many people who float above the waterline tend to have very similar backgrounds, very similar socioeconomic or cultural backgrounds, and then you lose a lot of the skills and talent that just doesn't float to the top because they may not have the terminology or the language or the credential that is assumed or expected to be required. So that moves us back to this inevitable question of the dependency on employers. So Jeff, I want to pivot you, because I do want to raise this question around language, especially with your military background, and you have such a diverse client base of how do we get to a place, again, the study that kicked this thing off, Calgary and the Precipice, I think we identified 300 different terms for the top 25 skills when we did the audit. And what the hell? When you've got the average of 8 terms per skill, what am I supposed to put on my cover letter? What am I supposed to put in my resume? What am I supposed to put in my job posting? What am I supposed to put in my syllabus as an educator? Because they're all different things, and often they mean the same thing. How do we get around this? And here's my question: at scale, because small scale pilots are fine. Scaling to 1.4 million people with diverse organizations from an entrepreneur up to a multinational corporation. How do we scale this idea of vocabulary, Jeff? Mute.
So yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's one of the key challenges, right? And it's one of the challenges that we face throughout. Is when is it a potato and when is it something else, right? And tomato kind of stuff. I think we do it through an understanding of output. Right? What is the outcome of the skill? Well, how is it applied? What does it do? Is when you get to that level, now it doesn't matter whether I'm using pomodoros or tomatoes. At the end, I still have tomato soup, right? And so the notion of that, and that also leads to the notion of transferability across different roles and different job contexts when you're talking about the outputs. And I think Europe's way ahead of us on this, because of the European competency framework and things like that, the qualifications frameworks, all the work that's been done in Europe to try and, build from the point of view of the outputs of skill and move towards a competency-based world. At scale, it really comes down to the, again, employers and educators and everybody else. You talked about the kind of monetary exchange, right? Is it a Swiss franc or a French franc, right? And what's the difference? and what are they actually worth. The crucible where that comes into play is in the workplace, in the job environment. And by recognizing and understanding and documenting some of the changes and some of the where, well, this is actually the same as that, at a small scale, we can eventually scale it up. One of the things that I mentioned earlier about the 1484 stuff with the IEEE standards is that in a open or linked open data environment in the semantic web, once the little bots get to the point where they can do this, if you have a large enough data set and enough things to compare it to, it's possible to know within a degree of probability that this is actually the same as this, even though they're not called the same thing, because you can see all of the underlying how you got to that competency. What were the learning experiences? What is the underlying knowledge? What other frameworks and things like that are linked to it? And that's the world that's coming. I mean, it's not here yet, but the standards are being created. And I mean, we're probably not 5 years away from this being the reality with Web 3.0. And so I think it scales because of technology and linked open data. And what we're creating here in Calgary is the first laboratory to watch it happen in real time. Between the learning environments and the employers, and see that true integration across the economy. So for me, it's like it's fascinating. It's exciting as hell.
Give me an example of the application of that Web3 bot, that universal translator, call it, right? My Star Trek, right? How does that actually work on that exchange? Does it impact me as an employer as I'm starting to filter potential candidates?
Yeah, I mean, what I think it does is in this kind of an environment, what you do is you eliminate the applicant tracking system and the keyword games that go on to where individuals try and twist themselves into a pretzel to conform to some arbitrary description of what the job requires from a job description on a thing. It's one of the reasons why smaller companies actually have an easier job hiring than the right skill set than larger companies do, is because they're not reliant on applicant tracking systems. So they have to find better ways, like actually sitting down and talking to people, or talking to people who know people who, and relying on recommendations from people that they trust. The notion of these open systems, I think, if I define competencies a certain way in my HR system, and other companies are doing the same thing, and through an open link data process, with a large enough data set, things that are being provided out of an educational environment can be compared, and you can start to understand where those where they line up. So it impacts the employer. They usually take the first step because it's in HR systems, but then the competencies cascade down through the whole rest of the system, and you can relate upwards, downwards, crossways, and from working with myself and Janet, we proposed 5, 6, 7 years ago now, this notion of an internet of skill, right? Where you could, knowing where you are, track yourself to anywhere else in the job economy on the basis of what you can actually do. And, that was a really cool idea back in 2017. Well, it's 2023 now, and it's happening, right? And I don't think we're 5 years away from it, from that. And I think it opens up the environment to individuals documenting skills that they acquire, regardless of where and how they acquire them, following a standardized, structure to those competency statements, and then connecting across a global network that allows us to understand that, well, this is actually the same as this, right? And I think it eliminates a lot of the barriers that exist currently for those folks that don't float to the top, like you mentioned. It eliminates a lot of the crap that goes on with foreign trained individuals, because we seem to have this notion in Canada that, skills are provincial. or local instead of national or international. Skills are global, right? And this allows the, again, to a degree of probability, those arbitrary barriers created by language and created by culture and things like that to disappear, because we're measuring things on the basis of outputs in the economy and how they're created.
Okay, I'm just gonna, you raise an interesting question I want to ask Heather and Kate about, because I'm not sure we're fully aligned. So the challenge, skills are global. There's no question about that. The challenge is, and I'm going to use the skills for success at the federal government level. We start creating pablum because we create this common language at such a level that is inoffensive. And when it comes to the actual competencies, as Jeff knows more than anyone, it's what can you do, but I actually need to measure that. I need to actually have very specific level 1 communications understanding versus level 2 versus level 3. And the reality is this, the small with small and medium enterprise representing 90+% of employers in the city, with their labor market often be geographically constrained. Is there not an opportunity to look at this at a city level, i.e. learning city, because it's far more consumable and doable rather than singing Kumbaya across the country, in which we can't agree on half of anything, let alone harmonization of terminology. So Heather, maybe because you are such a community-focused organization, and obviously there's a network of libraries globally, but how much of this local versus global do we need to think about when it comes to scaling competencies and learning?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say in order to, so you need to have success in terms of the impact of the pilot. You need to be able to test it in a small enough environment where you can see some change and measure impact so that you can tell the story of why would others get on board. So when I think about libraries and some of the work that we do, it's often one library system or one or two coming together with a shared interest, common goals, similar environments, and then creating a solution and testing it out. And then we have to tell the story to the other libraries. But even if we get the buy-in on a national level, we have to understand that it may be applied in a slightly different way, because just to look at a slightly different topic at the moment, there's a lot of discussion out there right now about safety and security in libraries. There's lots of changes that's happening in library environments, and I'm part of a national group that is exploring how to bring together shared terminology, recommendations, best practices, with the understanding though that we can create a common toolkit, a common language around it, but that every library is uniquely positioned to address the needs of their specific community, and each one's going to have a slightly different approach and a different take. So it's about creating the foundations and the baseline when I'm looking at it in this context, and understanding that it may be tweaked and adapted. But I still think like the foundations can still be similar. I think, that speaking to what Jeff's saying is like skills are global, right? So there's a foundation there that is shared, but then giving people the flexibility to adapt and adjust that model within their own municipal or whatever a provincial context, I think is more powerful, because then that innovation can continue, right? Because we don't also want to create something that then is formalized and never changes, right? That's not the intent. I think here is we want to continue to learn and grow, and that will continue to change, and we're going to learn something from different jurisdictions as that happens.
I'm not going to answer that question because I think Heather did a great job, and I'm actually going to respond to something that Jeff said that made me kind of take a pause and then think, if we're building a system that is dependent upon employers, I actually think employers are so far behind. Like, what we have to recognize is that employers are the laggards. And so I think we have to be careful when we are trying to build a system, a new way of doing things that is fully dependent on like employers and what they do. I mean, the number of conversations I know that we have at Calgary Economic Development where companies come in and they say, we need senior talent at XYZ level. and it has to be like in this sector, etc. And instead we say, well, why don't you think about bringing in like junior or mid-level talent that we have and then developing them? Because as Jeff said, you know that you always, if you hire somebody, you always train them for the job, right, that they're doing. A senior person can come in and have years, tens of decades of experience, and yet does need that employer specificity. And so I think it's about, yeah, I really struggle with this. If we're fully dependent on the employers, they are so far behind. Do they even know what they want? And so I think that that maybe the happy medium here is creating the construct and the system for change, and then employers will then be like, they will see the shift and then shift, right? And then be forced to shift, because there's really nothing, there's no other option, right? We are all moving this way. And so employers, I think, will follow, but I really struggle with like really focusing on employers, because they're so often, as you said, David, like so bad at hiring. They'll put together a job description and it's not even what they want the person to do, right? Like, I think, yeah, that's my comment.
So that's an interesting, and it's a very provocative statement that, you know, employers are the laggards. And as a guy embedded in post-secondary institutions, I'll tell you, the pace is a whole different conversation when you're dealing in a university or a college environment. Is that, do we think, and I got, obviously there's an entire continuum of employers, from super agile progressive on one end of the equation to this is the way we've done it for 50 years and we're going to continue to do it for 50 more years on the other side of the spectrum. Is the barrier, it's an interesting question, is the barrier employers? I've biasedly said the barrier actually is the employer's dependency on the slowest part of the system, which is the lack of the institutional capacity to change, because we can't keep pace because it takes us 2 years to change a course, right? So is 2/3 of the system the problem? Learners want to learn, but we've got employers and educators that are actually the speed bump to change. So maybe Jeff, will slide over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree with Kate, and that oftentimes employers don't actually have a clue what they want. You know, and we work with employers, you know, using supply chain management terminology around skills, and then start trying to manage those talent pipelines the way same you would imagine, you know, you would manage a supply chain in any other part of your business. And the hardest part is getting them to articulate what they really need, right? So I think part of the challenge as we go forward on this, and so particularly in this open learning lab, is the education of the employers that are involved in it, and understanding what the difference is between a competency and a skill, understanding the difference between you know, knowledge and competency. And recognizing how, you know, how to, you know, kind of circle, you know, connect the dots on this stuff. So there's a big role for outfits like LearningCITY, like the Open Learning Laboratory, to help educate the employers around this stuff. There's, I mean, maybe it's Calgary, right? I always say, despite all this wild ass cowboy image that we have some of the most risk-averse conservative business thinkers that I've ever run into in this town. You know, they've done it the way they've always done it. It worked in 1949 when we drilled that first well in Leduc. And damn it, we're going to keep doing it that way until someone forces us to change. And so the beauty of what's going on in Calgary now, I think, is we're getting a whole lot more tech-oriented, startup-oriented people into the city And they have no choice but to innovate around these areas because as you said, the institutions can't keep up. By the time you graduate, the technologies that you were learning on have changed. And so there's a tendency for the smaller tech-oriented organizations, I think, to be far more interested in doing this kind of thing than some of our more traditional employers might be. And the reality is, and you know this, David, we've talked about this as well, is that those traditional employers that we all point at as being the ones that are driving the economy in Calgary only represent, was it 20%, 15, 18, 20% of the actual people employed in this town? So there's lots of room to innovate around this stuff. There's an awful lot of room to bring in a different class of employer that is willing to innovate and play around with this stuff. And I think over time, you know, the laggards will get on board, as you know, because they won't have a choice, but B, when they start getting past, and when they start being no longer the necessarily employers of choice, they're losing the talent war because they can't adapt and innovate. That'll drive change because you need people to run your business. You know, and I think it's almost an organic occurrence. It'll evolve over time, and it'll be led by those companies that are willing to lead.
So Heather, I'm going to ask you again, and Jeff, you just closed up on something I think is really important, this idea of competition, and competition as a foundation for forcing change and innovation. And I think that's inherently one of the challenges of the traditional post-secondary system is there's some post-secondary institutions who receive 4 or 5 times more applicants than we can actually take. So there's an inertia to change, right? So, but Heather, one of the things I found working with you and the Center for Newcomers, the Genesis Center and Trellis, and our pilot 2 years ago was the incredibly innovative educational programming happening outside the quote unquote certified system. But you're at a competitive disadvantage because you're not able to hand somebody something that's perceived as valuable at the end of that program that says, congratulations, you've got X. It's more of a badge that, congratulations, here's the ribbon for participating, right? How have you been able to innovate and compete? Because I compete with you and you compete with me, which I think is wonderful, but you've got to be far more agile because you are starting the game behind the 8 ball relative to a certified institution.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So I've never really considered it in that sense, right, as a competition. But you're right, and I think when I think about the work that we're doing, and I think about innovation, and I'm going to use the example of open play and exploration. So libraries of the past, you know, some of you are probably familiar from your childhood, they were more about, you know, shelves with books. And certainly if you went into a children's area, it was very traditional, very structured, very all about resources, really strong, really powerful. But we realized that in looking at research and talking with patrons and all of that stuff, that we realized that people learn in so many different ways, and we are actually not supporting community in growing in the way that they could. And so we had to change our mindset, and we opened up and got into a place where we were okay failing. I say fail forward in terms of trying new things. And now if you go into public libraries across the city, you'll see early learning centers, which are open, loose place, messy, very messy and noisy and dynamic. But they're teaching kids about imagination and critical thinking and collaboration, all these skill sets that we want to foster. And that model has helped us to grow over time. And what's been our secret sauce is really about putting the learner at the center. It is about understanding how community is learning, understanding where the gaps are and what role we can play, not duplicating what others are doing, because that is just going to add another layer into the mix of another program that's just doing some of the similar things and sort of perpetuating the same idea or the same way of learning or approaches, but trying to understand this is a gap. and the library is uniquely positioned in this way, and so we're going to go for it. And then that way, again, when we think about how do we tell the story, how do we demonstrate the value of that, it's being able to articulate it within that broader concept, right? Is that we aren't a formal program, we aren't a formal space, but this in between that we offer helps to build these skill sets. And you identify a really critical part here, is that we don't have the certification piece, and that's the challenge, right? And sure, I could draft up a certificate, say like a kid spent, or an adult mentored one of our teens in the Teen Tech Center for 6 hours, and this created this kind of skill set. But it's not, then how do I validate that? And that's the challenge, right? Is how do we take those informal and non-credentials? We can be nimble, we can be flexible, and we can sort of adapt and adjust in ways that enable us to compete, because that is where we can compete, in being more flexible and adaptable. But then we have trouble on the outset doing the validation and the articulation, so that our learners and our partners who are all participating in that can utilize it and build on it. So it's a challenge for sure.
So, some of you may have heard me use the parallel. My previous life was in telecommunications. I worked in government regulatory affairs during the deregulation of the telecommunication networks in the early 1990s. And the parallels are identical. You had natural monopolies that had infrastructure and brands that could just roll over all their competition. And so what the government had to do was to break up components to be able to create an actually open and competitive environment. Things like phone numbers, which were owned by the telephone companies, became the property of the customer, so they could actually change and move to different competitors. We broke up all components of the network to be able to create that environment. And that's where I see it an absolute parallel, because I always use the analogy, and the data showed this, that 75% of the 3,000 organizations in our current learning system are over the age of 20, right? Less than 10% are under the age of 10 years. Why is that? What is it? Just because no one's had a good idea in the last 20 years? Or is it because there's such a dominant competitive advantage by legacy incumbents that they crush the innovators? And I'll use the example of, why are the 3 largest summer camp providers in Calgary post-secondary institutions? Why? Is it because they found some magical way to entertain 7-year-olds? Or is it because they have 2 competitive assets that create a monopoly and competitive disadvantage? Free access to property they were granted, so they have a campus that they don't have to pay for, and they have a brand that was fundamentally subsidized by the government. And as a result, when Heather or the YMCA or Jeff as an entrepreneur starts his own summer camp, he cannot compete and he's out of business. We need to look at the system far more structurally. If we truly want to open the system, we still can't have an entire group of providers that have a structural and competitive disadvantage that at a whim can actually crush all innovation in the system. So, Kate, on that note, throwing that over to you. And we've talked about this before. Opening the system truly means opening the system. It doesn't mean keeping 2 or 3 tiers in which we have the top tier and everyone else running around for the breadcrumbs, right? How do we open this up at a system level?
Yeah, well, I feel like honestly that's the holy grail of like what we're talking about here. How we open the system and really make it accessible for everybody. One thing that I really love about, I started the conversation about how employers are always so far behind and lagging and all of that. And then as Jeff was talking, I thought the really incredible thing about this open learning lab concept is employers can real time see the students and see the not-for-profits and our community partners in a space. And so for me, it's about providing access for all of those types of organizations and learners, employers, the community partners to in like some very weird way have like empathy for each other and like see, like live in each other's worlds for the time that they're in this lab. Because employers are stuck in their office towers, they're not seeing the learner learn in all of the different capacities that they can learn. And if they did, I think employers would understand the value of the skills that these learners have. And the only way that we're going to get employers to see on the ground how learning happens is to put them in a space with the learners and with our community partners, and provide these challenges and have students work on case studies with them and really see that this technical skills that all employers just so highly value can be learned in different ways. But a kid who has initiative and works hard every day is like, super rock star, but he might not have the technical expertise. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
Interesting, Kate, because one of the things that surprised me in regards to 3 weeks ago now, when we opened up applications to community members for the Open Learning Lab, we had a bunch of large corporations apply. And I thought it was all going to be startups, nonprofits, the kind of, for obvious reasons, gravitated to this collaborative work environment. And so as we started doing discovery sessions with large organizations, it was actually very progressive HR people that said, we've got an echo chamber problem. We want to have our executive leadership teams there, meetings there every month, because they need to get out of the comfort zone of their world and recognize, here's a few hundred 20-year-olds thinking differently than you as a 60-year-old or 50-year-old. And I think that's really, it's going to a place I hadn't anticipated, but it opens up the addressable market for the idea of who could collaborate in the lab at a totally different scale and level. So I'll just maybe open that to Jeff, Heather, or Kate, if you have any comments around the type of partners that would be pulled in as not charity work. And that's what I emphasize. If I get a sense that any partner's doing it because they want to give back to the community, I'm not interested. They've got to actually see that the exchange is a win-win, because then they're prepared to invest time into the effort. And Heather, maybe on your side, because you have such a diverse range of community partners, is that how you curate some of your programming and content, by looking across the different learners, the different partners, and where they play in the ecosystem together?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, again, for us, it comes down to like, what is the intention? Why would we partner, right? What is this going to have? And partnership's kind of a loaded word, because I would say that lots of people think of partnership as, well, I'm going to come use your space and you're going to provide the space and I'll offer my program. Nothing's changed. We've just extended. That's an angle of working together, for sure it is. But when I think about true partnership, it's about two or more parties coming together, creating a shared common goal, and then collaborating in a way that creates something you couldn't do on your own. And so when I think about the Open Learning Lab, and I think about the organizations who are applying, or it's, again, is it about bring your service and plop it in here, or is it about becoming a part of a community and then understanding what we're trying to accomplish together and how to move that forward? Because there is always place for those things where you just extend, you just satellite your services, sure. But I think what we're trying to accomplish with Open Learning Lab and with the LearningCITY Collective is transformative change. And if we're going to accomplish that, we have to be in a space where we have parties coming to the table who are willing to sort of throw out what we know and try new things. And that can be really challenging. But I will say that I'm not necessarily surprised that we're seeing some corporations coming to the table, depending on what their, in your discovery meetings, what their objectives are. But I've often met with employers of big companies who want to make the change. The question is how. They don't know where to start and they don't know how. And so that's what excites me about something with the Open Learning Lab is understanding how we create the space where they can start to see it. And really it is going to be about experiencing it and understanding how, again, you work together, that none of us have the answers, right? It's about providing the space to spark ideas and be that open collaborative connection point. so that we can learn and grow together. And some things we're going to try that are not going to work, and that's okay, because that's the whole point of this. But some things might catch, and that's where we need to build on them. So from a partnership perspective, that would be my comment.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, speaking as a little guy, not a big corporate, we always wind up getting the dregs of graduates. We get the ones that the big guys can't hire. And so I mean, from a small company perspective, being involved in the lab gives us an opportunity to be first in line, to test drive the students, to really understand what those skill sets are, right? And and again, that's a competitive advantage. Now we have to, I mean, to be involved in this, there's I mean, it goes both ways. We have to have skin in the game, and we have to become involved in the learning environment and everything else. But for an organization to be able to have that ability, you know, to large or small, to be able to really understand a candidate, not the fake candidate that shows up for a job interview, because they're always on their best behavior and they're being who they are, right? I almost look at this as almost like a Big Brother environment, where at a certain point, people forget that the cameras are on, right? And they become themselves. And so interactions like that are really powerful for a company, for a manager, to see what people are really like under pressure, to see how they really react, how they really work in teams within their, you know, even in a learning environment, in a way that we can't ever see now, right? You know, one of the advantages of working with some of the cohorts that we worked with in your marketing class, Dave, it's the same reason, is because we got to really see, you know, how these kids created things together, how they worked as a team, how they, you know, how they accomplish things. And for us, that's extremely powerful. And as outside of a learning lab or outside of a work integrated learning environment, there is almost no opportunity for a small business to get involved in anything like that.
Awesome. So I want to open this up to, you know, we've got people from across, as I look at the people's names here, everyone's across the system here. Open it up. So feel free to unmute if you have a question or a comment or thought you'd like to put on the table, and take the pressure off Kate, Heather, and Jeff. You don't even need to put up your hand, just need to unmute. Or I'll treat you like my students and poke you if you don't. Anyone? Brent, you've been active on the chat, man. You must have something to contribute.
Lots of changes, obviously, and I think everyone has the best intentions. I guess it's sort of that optimistic, pessimistic, realistic, and I guess, where are the supporters? Do you see? Where are the detractors? Where's the tide flowing? I'm kind of curious.
Jeff, Heather, Kate. Trends and momentum.
It's funny, like I think, you know, any kind of innovation like this, in when you've got some, like you talk about, you know, the monopolies and the clearly established players, I think there's going to be as many people sitting on the sidelines waiting for us to fail, waiting for us to blow up spectacularly, as there are going to be people cheerleading for us to do something really cool and innovative. And we have to be aware of that, right? There's an awful lot of entrenched status quo, you know, and what we're doing is going to upset an awful lot of people in an awful lot of ivory towers, and not all those ivory towers are in academia, because we're going to bypass the traditional way of doing things. It's going to piss people off in government if we can prove that this works, right? There's people who are waiting for us to fail. And so our job, our challenge, I guess, Brent, is not to fail.
And to be fair, and Katie, I'll jump over to you, but to be fair, Brent, these are things I've been asking for, begging for, and I see Sharon there for a decade, and had virtually no support, certainly internally, let alone externally. And I think we're in the don't waste a good crisis momentum here, whether it be 32% vacancy rate, whether it be a fear of the skills gap, whether it be a fear of the future. I think the combination of those three things, when you look at who's been able to invest in this, Oxford donating over $300,000 worth of real estate, the City of Calgary funding OPEX, 30 classes and 15 professors said, sure, I'll teach downtown. And, 600 or 700 kids currently registered to say, sure, I'll take a class downtown. It's all those things that everyone's taking risk. I don't think that would have been a risk that anyone would have taken 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And I think that we've got a magic moment here in the city that's different than other jurisdictions, because there is risk here. People recognize the risk and they accept the risk and say, let's do things different. So Katie, I saw your hand up. Do you want to add on to Bill on that?
Are you talking about me?
Catch up. Sorry.
Okay, gotcha.
Maybe not. Oh, Sharon's hand's up. You just.
Hey,
Sure.
David, and everyone, I'm on my phone, so I won't, I'm in the car, so I won't turn on my camera, but I just wanted to push on something that you said, David, and how long we've been talking, and someone else voiced this, where we've been talking about the difference between knowledge, competencies, and skills, and all the different taxonomies for those things. Do you think that this crisis of the future, as you just talked about it, where so many of the temporary skill training areas that universities have tried to play catch up in, right? And realizing that, now it's just moving so fast and being replaced by software in many ways that they can't catch up. Do you think you have an opportunity, given this sort of hyper momentum that's happening around some of these low-hanging skills training where universities have dabbled? Do you think there's an opportunity for really rethinking some of the future curriculum that will happen in the Open Learning Lab towards those more, as I've heard it talked about, like skill, permanent knowledge or permanent competencies, right? That you carry with you for life, as opposed to, some of the things we discovered, like, getting a university to try to keep up with, the latest programming language and training people on that. It doesn't fit anymore. So to summarize, do you think that this movement, this hyper movement around AI and some other changes in the sort of post-industrial business landscape will even change what will be on the curriculum in 2 years in the Open Learning Lab? Is there even a greater opportunity to redesign some of that?
Well, I'm gonna poke Kate, Heather, or Jeff on that, and I'm just gonna give Sharon credit to one of the greatest terms I've ever heard, and I use it all the time, and I do cite you, Sharon. The idea of short-term job-specific skills that have a very short life cycle, as we know. Sharon used the term once, disposable skills, which I love that, because that's exactly what they are. They have a short lifetime. So there's the sustained skills, the enabling skills, and then there's the disposable skills that have this short value life cycle. And
of course I cribbed that from somewhere and I can't remember where, but it wasn't my idea. I was like, because disposable doesn't mean that they're not worthwhile. It just means they're temporary.
they're
right?
temporary.
Versus that thing that you learned, that like your question around that learning moment that was really transitional and impactful in your life, that you do carry with you through changes in technologies, changes in business models, changes in geographies, right? And so I think universities tried to, David and I have a very similar, academic and professional background. And when I saw universities trying to keep up with programming languages, just as an example, it was like, this is a losing battle here. And what are we doing, right? Why are we trying to teach disposable skills in a model that requires minimum of 6 times teaching it before any ROI of break even happens on a course, right? And it's in a big box course. So the business model just didn't work for me financially, and also, just a losing battle on many things. But I'm just wondering, like you said, is there an opportunity over the next 2 years to say, well, what will the courses, quote unquote, look like if in fact so many of those basic skills, like programming, will be a commodity? Being a really good prompt engineer around coding will not be a commodity, right? But to do that, you have to understand, syntax and language construction and all kinds of skills that you take with you for life, right? Like an English degree may be useful again in prompt engineering, right?
Yeah,
You know what I
one
mean?
of the elements, and I do want to open this up for one of the elements, what's been interesting institutionally is there's 3 departments that are part of the Open Learning Lab at one university, of which we opened it up to all the departments of the institution, right? So think about that there were other departments in the business school, other departments in different, arts, sciences, community, had no interest in actually, very little interest in participating in this, let alone I've invited every post-secondary institution to participate as well. There's a variety of different structural and organizational reasons why that's challenging. But I think, Sharon, I've always said this, and you and I do have a similar background. My first 2 degrees are in the arts. I think the greatest opportunity here are in the Open Learning Lab are actually students from the arts that are a year away from graduation, that are able to think about how they can apply those incredibly important skills they've learned, but think about the application of those skills in a professional context. And that's always tends to be one of the challenges in a post-secondary.
100%. Well,
Right.
and the fine arts students even more knew the special sauce and magic wand that they've actually learned as part of their education and knew how to apply that in our world. I mean, everything I've learned as a teacher, I've stolen from fine arts education, right? And I teach in business school. So, it's clear. But I just think there's this massive opportunity to not be teaching, basic stats, but being teaching, really understanding numbers and mathematics, right? And as a core, non-disposable competency, right? So, and things like that, but also language skills, music skills, they make for really elegant programmers and designers, right, of the future. So I just think it could be a really interesting curriculum landscape 2 years from now, very different than where we're starting.
Choose your own adventure. All right, Kate, I'm going to give everyone Kate, Heather, and Jeff will give you one final comment as we wind down here. And I want to thank everyone for participating. Kate, how about tie a bow around it?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things I want to say in response to Sharon and Brent, your questions. So maybe what I will end with is like going along the same track. I think the advances in technology, artificial intelligence being the one that we're currently experiencing, but I'm sure there is going to be another massive technology transition 5-10 years from now, is in fact changing the way that everyone is thinking about learning and everyone is thinking about what skills they have. And I think that it applies to everything, right? Like it applies to if you can write an email because AI could do that for you. It applies to making a PowerPoint presentation. AI could do that for you. And so I think we're at this juncture where everyone is now questioning what skills they have and what value they bring to their employer, to their sphere of influence, right? And so I think that's really why this conversation is so interesting, because I'm excited that Calgary is having this conversation in a proactive way instead of 3 years from now when, as Lee said in the chat, like coders are dead. And now we're all like, oh, we were trying to transition to a tech economy and we have all these coders now, but they're useless because of AI, right? And so my final thought is one of optimism that we are having these conversations, and thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kate. Heather.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I also end on a note of optimism. I think for me, we've all seen the risks over the last few years of not being agile, and not being prepared, and not having the ability to pivot quickly when things go in a way that we're not expecting. And I think the opportunity that we have in front of us with things like the Open Learning Lab is to open up our learning systems. There is tremendous value in what we can offer across the spectrum of learning organizations and employers. And I think that being more purposeful in creating opportunities for collision and collaboration is going to help us to better understand the landscape that we're living in today and how we can move it forward. And I personally think from what I've seen and the organizations that I've been speaking to, that Calgary is the perfect place to try this. I think we are well positioned to do this.
Awesome. All right, Jeff, bring us home.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, what they said. You know, I think the need for innovation is clear, right? And the half-life of skills, the half-life of learning is getting progressively shorter and shorter and shorter. One of the things that I think came out of you know, in the recent, like within the last year, back when the machines were only taking blue-collar jobs, no one seemed to really give a crap. Right. And then we all had our pond half full of lily pads moment in the professions when, you know, ChatGPT passed a Wharton MBA exam and then passed a bar exam in Pennsylvania. Right. And all of a sudden professionals went, holy crap. Right. And what we're finding now is yeah, if having the answer, the knowledge was your value proposition to the world, you just lost. So where we find now the value comes in the integration of knowledge across multiple different contexts and the collaborative environment between people and the way that people interact with different problems in different environments and different organizations. And those are very, very human skills, which they don't teach in tech school, right? And so I think that we're you know, in many ways the challenges that we face and the innovations that we're talking about are going to drive the human interface in business and the human interface in organizations to the front, and make those skills, the human skills, that much more important. And I think the lab is a wonderful opportunity for us to practice that and see it happen live. So it's going to be really cool, right? And you know, we'll see in a year what it all looks like. But I'm excited as hell about it. I think it's going to be really, really cool. And I think we're gonna open up a lot of people's eyes into a completely different way of thinking about learning, collaboration, and how different organizations and different people and different sizes of organizations and different contexts can come together and create something that's just no one could have done on their own.
And it's interesting, Jeff, and just closing up on that point, because it's really going backwards, not forwards, right? It says people in the same room actually matter.
Yeah.
People from different backgrounds matter. And the 1 + 1 can equal 3. And it challenges the assumption that life can be replaced by this, and it can't. And so there's the challenging the norm. And by the way, it also says people want to be downtown, and challenges the assumption that everyone's happy in their bunny slippers in front of a screen. We'll see. So I want to thank everyone for participating. Please check out learningcity.ca. All the information on the program in the Open Learning Lab and Accelerate You in Learning City is there. And hope to see you on our next session. Thanks, everyone.